All right, this next big topic will be on perception, how our brain makes sense of the input to our eyes and our ears and our skin and all our other sensory organs and kind of constructs out of that our whole experienced reality. Now, for this course, we're going to focus on the most well-studied modality, which is visual perception, though almost all the principles and theories that we'll learn about, they apply equally to hearing and taste and touch and balance and pain and all our other perceptual experiences. So let's dive into visual perception by just sort of starting with visual sensation, which means how we register what we see. Not surprisingly, the eyes are involved, but specifically we see things when light bounces off an object out there in the world, gets focused by the cornea and the lens at the front of our eye, and then gets projected onto the retina at the back of the eye. The retina is just a layer of neurons back there, which includes neurons that fire when light hits them, called photoreceptors. So we'd say that the retina, it transduces the light. Transduce is just another word for converting from like physical energy, like light energy, to action potentials, to sending a pew, 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 pew signal of, electrochemical neural signal into the brain, from the eye into the brain. It goes out this optic nerve here at the back of the eye. So this here is a diagram where we're looking at someone's brain from above their head. So you're like looking down on someone's brain from above. The eyes are at the front of the head there. And you can see that things in the right visual field, meaning things off in the right periphery, right? Things to your right, what we see in pink here on the diagram, the light from that part of the world, it's going to hit the retina, the back of our eyes, on the left side of each eyeball, right? It's going to hit things off to your right are going to get to both of your eyes, but they're always going to hit one predictable side of your eyes. So if you kind of follow those pink wires as they exit the eye in a bundle of axons, that's called the optic nerve. And notice that half of each retina is sending its information back to the left hemisphere of this person's brain, ending up at the occipital lobe in the back of the brain, right? Which we know is the primary brain area for processing visual information. Meanwhile, if you look out in front of the head at the left visual field, so the gray part there where they've drawn it, notice how anything off in your left periphs will hit the far right side of each eyeball, and thus that eye will send its signal to the right hemisphere of the brain. So that's what we mean when we say vision, like most of our senses, is contralateral. It's not that what hits your left eyeball goes to the right side of your brain, because stuff out there hits both of your eyeballs. Rather, it's stuff in your left visual field. The left part of the world in front of you, that's what's processed by your right hemisphere. Now here we're looking instead at someone's brain kind of from behind. So imagine you've snuck up behind someone, you're looking at their occipital lobe from the back, right? So if we could kind of see through to their brain. So the occipital lobes are all along the back there, but specifically there's something called the primary visual cortex, often just called V1 for visual and then 1 for primary. It's the first major stop, the first place that the brain starts making sense of input from our eyes. And the layout here is actually really cool. We call it a retinotopic organization or a retinotopic mapping, just meaning that each neuron here in the back of your brain corresponds to light input hitting a specific point on your retina, all the way, at the front of the head in your eyeball, which means light coming from a specific point in the visual field in front of you turns on a specific neuron back there in the back of your brain in the occipital lobe. Like, imagine you're staring directly forward at a little X on a screen in front of you, okay? That bit of the visual field you're staring directly at, the light from that, it's going to go straight to the very back of your eyes. It's going to hit the center of each retina on a little bit we actually call the fovea of your eye. Now, imagine while you're staring at that X in the middle of the screen, you don't move your eyeballs a bit. You're just staring at the X, and maybe a little fly lands on your screen, just a little up and to the left from that. So just a little in your sort of upper left periphs, right? Basically, it lands in the part of the visual field we've labeled 5 here in this top diagram. When that happens, the light from that fly that comes into your eyes, right, it's going to hit at just the right angle. It's coming from the upper left, so the signal is going to go to the right occipital lobe in your brain, and there's a neuron back there on the right part of your brain that will fire because the fly landed in that zone of your periphs, right? It sort of tracks that. On the other hand, if the fly had landed in what we've labeled like section 12 here, meaning it's off in your far lower right periphery. You're still staring straight forward at the X, but the fly is off in your periffs in the bottom right. If that happens, we'll see a neuron there in section 12, right? What we've labeled here, this one little section of your occipital lobe, a neuron will go off a split second later when the fly shows up there. So all the neurons that go off when you see something in the lower right visual field, all those are next to each other in the brain, over there where we've drawn section 12 of the occipital lobe here. In other words, we've got a mapping of the whole visual field. So much so that if I know which area of the primary visual cortex is firing, I know which part of someone's visual field a stimulus just showed up in. We actually, with an fMRI, can roughly tell what shape of a letter someone is looking at. If you project a big A or a V or an H or an O in front of someone, we can actually tell what they're looking at just from scanning their brain back here in V1 and seeing where neurons are lighting up, which tells us where some light was in the visual field in front of someone. Now, one last thing to note here is that the brain, back here in the occipital lobe, what we've labeled as areas 1, 2, 3, and 4, notice they're pretty big here in the brain, meaning there's lots of neurons for those. They have tons of neurons that go off when light hits areas 1, 2, 3, and 4 up here in the visual field in front of us. So notice how small of a part of the visual field those big old brain areas are dedicated just to tracking and processing and making sense of. That's because we have a lot more neurons dedicated to the fovea, to the part of the visual field we're looking directly at, than we do to stuff off in our periphery. That's why we can actually see details really well and read things just fine when we're looking directly at them, but we can't read or make out details for things off in our periffs unless they're in like gigantic print, right? Now, our retina and our brain, they evolved to have this. They evolved to have tons of neurons dedicated to detail vision near the center. That's helpful for us to survive. Okay. Now, as I mentioned earlier, what's actually hitting the eye when we see something, when we use vision, is light waves. But light waves are actually just a subtype of electromagnetic radiation. They're visible light. It's just a portion of the spectrum. It's the same kind of thing as infrared light or ultraviolet light or even X-rays or FM radio and AM radio waves. Those are all part of the same thing. It's the same stuff, just different wavelengths of that light, of that electromagnetic radiation. But our retina has turned that into neurons firing. So if it's at the right wavelengths, if it's in the visible part of the spectrum, the little rainbow we're familiar with, that's the light that turns on our little eye detectors, turns that into neural firing, in other words, into action potentials. Now the real question is, how does a really fast series of pew, 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 like neural firing from the back of our eyes, from our retina, how do neurons firing become a visual experience? The thing we actually perceive, the thing we see. That's what we'll be talking about in detail here in this and the following videos, the process of perception. We'll define it as the process of maybe kind of recognizing, organizing, and interpreting sense information, like the stuff that hits our retina, and turning that into, action potentials in a way that our brain can make sense of them. Now, before we get into specific effects and theories, we need to understand something really fundamental here, that we don't really directly perceive reality. At a basic level, what we see, visual perception, is not exactly what's out there in the world. Think of it this way. We can start by talking about an object out there in the world. We often call this, we have a special name for this, we call it the distal object, because distal just means distant. In other words, it's out there, it's separate from our body, right? So for example, if Justin Bieber is standing in front of me and I'm looking at his stupid face, that's the distal object. It's his actual face out there in the world, right? Then that, if I'm going to perceive his face, the light has to bounce off of it and travel to my eyes. So you've got this, we call it informational medium that light has to travel through, like air, right? Light has to go through the air. So the light from the sun, it's bouncing off his face. It's going through the air between us, maybe even through fog or smoke that might blur the light if it's a certain, time of day or certain conditions. But finally, the light hits my eyeball, okay? At that point, what actually hits the back of my eye is not his face. His face isn't inside my eye, right? It's just some light that's gotten into my eye. So it's a projection of his face, basically a flat and two-dimensional projection on the back of my retina, like you can see here. So we call that projection, if we want to talk about the pattern of light that hits our eye, the pattern of light that lands on our retina, we call that the proximal stimulus. So when I'm seeing something, the stimulus, that's kind of ambiguous what I mean. The stimulus, if I mean the light hitting my eyes, that's the proximal stimulus. Proximal meaning like close, right? It's in our proximity, as opposed to the distal stimulus, the actual object out there. So the proximal stimulus, that's the only thing our brain has access to, because in vision, we never actually make contact with the distal object, right? I don't touch my eye to Justin Bieber's face, thank goodness. So it's that pattern of light, the proximal stimulus, that turns on a bunch of neurons at that part of my retina, sends a pew, 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 pew of action potentials back to my brain, which spends tens of milliseconds, maybe even hundreds of milliseconds, processing that information with tons and tons and tons of neurons firing. And only at that point, only after all of that processing, do we actually see something? Do we actually have a conscious visual experience? And what we experience, that's called the perceptual object. It's the actual, like, this is what I'm seeing. But that's after being processed a lot in my brain, right? And it might at that point be quite different from the actual distal object out there in the world, based on my past experiences, my associations, how I feel about the thing I'm seeing, stuff like that. So two people can look at the exact same object and have a very different visual experience, a different perception. So let's try something. I'm going to show you some words here on the screen, really brief. I'm just going to show you some words, and as quickly as possible, read the following to yourself. Just in your head, try and read these words. So here we go. Now, most people have no problem reading this despite the weird font. It's hard work digging clay, save it for a rainy day. To read that, our brain has to interpret all the squiggles there, right, based on patterns that we've seen before. But look closer at the last word in each line. It's the same exact stimulus. The clay in the top line and day in the bottom line, same exact stimulus, meaning the same pattern hits our eyes. But based on the context of other words we've read in the sentence already, our brain sees it as a D or it sees it as a CL. The same light input, the same proximal stimulus can hit our eyes, but in different contexts, we might see something different, meaning perceive something different. So even with something simple like this, we can already see that context and past experience or our knowledge, that stuff matters for our perception. We sometimes talk about this as top-down effects on perception. And what do we mean by that? Well, you can contrast it with bottom-up perception, where our perception is driven by the actual input from our sensory system, by the light that came in and made that proximal stimulus on our retina. Like, what is it to see a square? Think about what it means for me to visually see a square by the light hitting my eyes. Well, basically it's just made up of four lines in an appropriate relationship to each other, right? So we perceive a square when that pattern of light hits our eyes. The lines have to be in the right kind of orientation to each other. How does your brain recognize it's seeing the letter H? When you're reading a word that has a letter H in it, well, it sees two vertical lines and it sees a horizontal line and they're arranged in the right way, so we perceive an H, right? When that pattern of light hits our eyes. That's kind of bottom-up visual processing. It's just straightforward adding up of the input to our eyes. So take the parts, put them together, you get the whole. But that wouldn't explain why we can see like the same proximal stimulus hitting our eyes and read it or perceive it two completely different ways, depending on the words we happen to read a split second earlier in the rest of the sentence, depending on the context or the cues around it. So bottom up, it's the same input, the clay or day. Bottom up, it's the same input. So the only explanation is the brain is also using top-down evidence, top-down influences, things like context and previous knowledge, to actively interpret and make assumptions in constructing what we actually perceive when we look at something like this. And there are lots of examples where we fail to perceive what does exist out there in the stimulus. Like, look at this picture and what do you see? Most people don't actually see anything when they first look at it. They don't pick up any meaningful pattern here. So you may want to pause the video and look at it for a while before I give the answer. Okay, so if you didn't see it yet, there's a cow's head in this picture, taking up most of the left half. So the cow's head is here. There's like, an ear here, an ear here. This is the front of the cow's face. Now, the information was there in the stimulus from the start, but without hints or cueing, your brain may not have recognized it. But here's the thing. Now that you've seen the cow in the picture, even just this one time, you could see the same picture a year from now and your brain will automatically recognize and perceive the cow within it. Similar idea with this one. There's something in this picture. Can you tell what it is? Once again, if you don't see it immediately, you might pause the video and see if you can get it to click. Okay, don't worry if you don't see it. Most people don't at first, but there's a dog in the middle of the picture here. So it's a Dalmatian maybe with his head down, you know, in the center there. Now the bottom up information might be ambiguous and missing a lot of details, right? But once your brain is primed to see it, once you've had that experience and stored it as a memory, right? That top down knowledge will ensure that you always see the dog in this image in the future. Like here, the dog is probably very clear now, even though originally we might have totally failed to perceive something that was always there in the stimulus. So same stimulus, very different perception, very different experience. You see something different from the same input to your eyes, depending on your past experience. That's top down. That makes sense. And sometimes we perceive things that do not actually exist in the stimulus. So these figures I'm showing here, for example, they show an effect called illusory contours. We perceive edges, we perceive contours in something like this where there aren't really any in the picture itself. Like there's not really an upside down blue triangle in the center of the left image, although we all kind of perceive one there. Instead, it's just a blue background and it has some white kind of Pac-Man shapes and 3 acute angles in white, but our brain sees those Pac-Man angles line up. And usually when things are all in a straight line like that, it's an edge, right? So the brain invents an edge. In other words, we perceive an edge. We see one there, even though it's not really in the stimulus. Same thing with the upside down white triangle in the middle panel or the big arrow pointing up on the right panel. There's not really an arrow there so much as just one invented by our brain because past experience tells us that usually those black lines and angles wouldn't all line up so perfectly and stop so abruptly unless something with straight lines was blocking our view by being closer to us, right? So that's how your brain perceives it. That's how the brain defaults to interpreting it. We perceive things that aren't necessarily there. Likewise, what we perceive is not always identical to the distal object out there in the world. You might be familiar with the dress, which went viral in 2015. People looking at the exact same picture saw it in a completely different way, a completely different set of colors than their friends and their family members. People argued back and forth about it, with some people really sure it's a black and blue dress, and some of their friends clearly seeing it as a white and gold dress, and thought that the blue and black people were totally nuts. Now, after the fact, it was actually easy to find out the real color of the dress. If you look it up online or see the lady in a picture wearing it, everyone agrees it's a blue and black dress. And literally any other picture, everyone's like, yeah, blue and black. Yet so many people look at that first image and can't help but perceive white and gold. Their brain makes them see white and gold of a dress that's actually blue and black. And if that's what you see, you're not wrong in some sense, right? At least not in the sense of being wrong about your own perception. You are perceiving white and gold. That is what you are seeing, but only because the blue and black dress was in kind of weird and ambiguous lighting in that one picture, and your brain made an educated guess about its color, and it just happened to make a slightly different educated guess than other people. So like here on the left, this is just a little sample of the image, right? From the darker part and a sample from the lighter part of the picture. They've just pulled it over here, zoomed in a little bit, right? Then the next panel, we've just kind of smoothed those colors out within each sample, and you can see the basic pattern of the 2 colors in the dress. So that's what's actually hitting our eyes. For all of us, we're all seeing the same, well, I should say, we're all getting the same input, the same proximal stimulus to our eyes. We're all getting these 2 colors as a proximal stimulus to our eyes. That's what reaches our retina after going through the informational medium, like the conditions like lighting and atmosphere and all that. That's what makes up the proximal stimulus. So this is the basic pattern of the dress. Why do some people see it one way and some people see it a different way when it comes to our conscious perception, to what we recognize as the colors? Let's zoom in on that a little bit, that basic pattern. When this input hits our eyes, it's actually kind of ambiguous. There are multiple different ways that we could end up getting this same input to our eyes. Multiple different ways the world could be, multiple different realities that would lead to that same proximal stimulus hitting our eyes. For example, we would get this for a dark object that was washed out by bright light, or we'd get the exact same thing hitting our eyes for a lighter object that was in some shade. So like the middle part here. That's what's hitting our eyes. That's hitting our eyes, but the brain kind of assumes, some people's brain, we should say, assumes it's due to the left sort of situation. That what we've got is a white and gold dress, but we're seeing it in a shadow, and that's why when this hits our eyes, we're like, oh yeah, it's a white and gold dress. Clearly, it's just in a shadow. Other brains, though, assume that when we're looking at that picture, the one that went viral, it's due to the right kind of situation, the one on the right here, that we've got an actual blue and black dress. It just happens to be washed out by some bright light, and that's why this color, right, this color is hitting our retina. If perception was purely bottom up, we would always perceive the middle input as the same color, right? The middle input hits our eyes, we would all agree it's the same anytime, right? We'd all experience the same thing. But that means when lighting changed even the slightest bit, it would seem like every object in the world was changing color all the time. Every little thing in our environment all day long, constantly changing color. We'd be living in a crazy world of color flux just due to those lighting changes. And instead, the brain, it makes guesses based on context. It takes into account things like lighting. In other words, it sort of corrects for the lighting situation before we actually perceive and experience a color. It always uses other information about the conditions and context to guess what the real distal object's color is, and then makes us perceive that guess. And when the cues aren't there, when we run into a genuinely ambiguous situation without enough extra context to help us disambiguate, whether this is washed out by bright light or in a shadow, then we occasionally end up with our brains coming to different conclusions and we see something different than our family and friends. So as we've seen here, what we perceive is not equal to the real distal stimulus out there. We sometimes perceive things different than they are. And what we perceive is also not exactly the proximal stimulus that hits our eyes. It's the brain's interpretation, where it's using cues and context to construct its best guess of what objects are out there causing the proximal stimulus we're registering. So, for example, I might give you a simple question. We'll start with a simple question first, like, how many books are in this picture? And you can count, there's 2 or whatever. Or which of these 2 tables is long and skinny versus, closer to more of a square shape, right? If you look at the tabletops, pretty clear. Everyone clearly sees 2 books and sees the left table is the long and skinny one. That's easy, right? Which is a perfectly good interpretation of what you're seeing, even though it's kind of wrong, because what's hitting your eye is way different than what your brain is presenting to you, because those 2 tabletops are actually 100% identical. Same length, same width, same angles involved. The illusion here is called Shepherd's tables. It's pretty famous, and let me show you it with a quick video so you believe me.
The 2 tabletops I drew are exactly the same size. You're going to need proof for this, but you can easily draw this too. The proof cutout is exactly the same dimensions as the tabletops as well.
Let's see that one more time.
Tabletops I drew are exactly the same size. You're going to need proof for this, but you can easily draw this too. The proof cutout is exactly the same dimensions.
Yeah, so even after we're showing, it can sometimes be really hard to perceive it that way. We'll still see the one on the left as being longer and skinnier. What hits our retina here is tabletops of literally identical size and shape, same angles and distances. That's the input to our brain via action potentials coming out of our retinal cells, but that's not what we perceive. We don't perceive these 2 tabletops as being the exact same size and shape, right? We perceive something different because our brain interprets this as a 3-dimensional scene. It interprets this as having depth thanks to things like shading cues and other information in the picture. And if you still don't believe me, I've just literally in the PowerPoint slides here, I've just copied the same PowerPoint object and used the rotate command to rotate at different amounts. And you can see, yep, the object is the same. The tabletops are the same. You can just measure it on your own screen if you want to. Often, once we take away the surrounding context cues that hint to our brain that we should interpret it with 3D depth, then it becomes easier to perceive the objects as being the same and realize, oh yeah, I was just being tricked. So through all these examples, the main thing to take away is that what we see, what we visually experience, is not just an accurate accounting of the stimulus hitting our sense organs, but a construction, a guess, an interpretation made by the active brain processes to kind of simulate what it thinks is happening in the world out there that might have caused this kind of input to our retina. So in the next few videos, we'll see some more specific examples that have been studied a lot in the laboratory, We'll then dive into some various theories of perception, especially kind of just the basic bottom-up theories of perception. Then we'll talk about some top-down influences on perception. And finally, we'll get a little bit into the neural mechanisms and relevant brain networks for perception.